Sometimes the most devastating truths hide behind the faces we love most. Charles thought he knew everything about his wife Camilla after 23 years of marriage. He believed their love story was written in stone, carved with promises of forever and sealed with dreams they had built together. But, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, while reaching for her forgotten phone to silence an alarm, he would discover that some secrets are so powerful they can destroy a lifetime of trust in a single moment. What he found on that screen would not just break his heart, it would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman sleeping peacefully beside him. The morning sun filtered through the cream-colored curtains of their bedroom, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor that Charles had installed himself 3 summers ago. He remembered how Camilla had stood in the doorway, her hands on her hips, watching him measure and cut each plank with the precision that came naturally to him. She had laughed then, calling him her perfectionist, and brought him cold lemonade while he worked. Those seemed like memories from another lifetime now. Charles stirred from his sleep as the persistent buzz of a phone alarm cut through the peaceful quiet of their suburban home. The sound was coming from Camilla's side of the bed, where she lay curled up under their shared quilt, her dark hair spread across the pillow like silk threads. She had always been a heavy sleeper, especially after her late shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse practitioner. 23 years of marriage had taught him not to wake her when she finally got the chance to rest. He reached across her sleeping form, careful not to disturb her, and picked up her phone to silence the alarm. The screen lit up under his touch, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There were message notifications covering the display, but it wasn't the number of messages that stopped his heart. It was the name at the top of the list. Marcus. The same Marcus who had been Camilla's colleague for the past 2 years, the one she mentioned casually during dinner conversations, the one whose name had started appearing in her stories more frequently over recent months. Charles felt his hands begin to tremble as he stared at the preview of the latest message. The words that appeared on the screen were like daggers piercing through his chest. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. When can we meet again? The phone felt heavy in his hands, as if it had suddenly transformed from plastic and glass into solid lead. His mind raced, trying to find an innocent explanation for what he was seeing. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Marcus had sent the message to the wrong person. Maybe there was some reasonable explanation that would make sense of the words that seemed to be dancing mockingly on the screen before him. But even as he grasped for these desperate explanations, another part of him began to connect dots that had been scattered across recent months. Camilla's increased attention to her appearance, the new perfume she had started wearing, the late-night shifts that seemed to happen more frequently, the way she had started guarding her phone, keeping it face down during dinner, taking it with her to the bathroom, charging it on her side of the bed instead of on the kitchen counter where it used to live. Charles set the phone down gently beside her, his movements mechanical and precise. He slipped out of bed with the same careful quietness he had used thousands of mornings before, but everything felt different now. The familiar routine of his morning, checking the weather, starting the coffee, letting their golden retriever Bailey out into the backyard, all of it felt like he was watching someone else live his life. In the kitchen, he went through the motions of making breakfast, his hands moving automatically while his mind struggled to process what he had seen. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet house with its familiar sound. Bailey scratched at the back door, eager for his morning walk. The newspaper landed on their front porch with its usual thud. Everything was exactly as it should be, except that Charles's world had fundamentally changed in the span of a few seconds. He found himself staring out the kitchen window at the garden they had planted together last spring. Camilla had insisted on roses despite his warnings that they were difficult to maintain. She had been so excited about those roses, spending hours researching the best varieties for their climate, ordering special fertilizer, marking her calendar with watering schedules. They had bloomed beautifully through the summer, filling their backyard with color and fragrance. Now, looking at them in their late autumn dormancy, Charles wondered if everything about their shared life had been as superficial as those seasonal blooms. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted his thoughts. Camilla appeared in the kitchen doorway, stretching and yawning, looking exactly like the woman he had fallen in love with 25 years ago. Her hair was messy from sleep, her face free of makeup, wearing the old college t-shirt she always slept in. She looked innocent and beautiful and completely unaware that her husband had just discovered what appeared to be evidence of her betrayal. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, walking over to kiss his cheek as she did every morning. Her lips felt like ice against his skin, though he knew the coldness was coming from within him rather than from her. Did my alarm wake you? I'm so sorry. I keep forgetting to turn it off on my days off. Charles managed to nod and make some non-committal sound that passed for a response. He watched as she moved around their kitchen with the same easy familiarity she had shown for decades. She knew exactly where everything was, had memorized his preferences for how he liked his coffee, automatically started preparing his lunch for work even though it was her day off. These small acts of consideration, which had always filled him with warmth, now felt like elaborate performances designed to hide her deception. Are you feeling all right? She asked, studying his face with the trained eye of a healthcare professional. You look pale. The concern in her voice seemed genuine, which only made everything more confusing. How could she stand there, looking at him with what appeared to be real love and worry, when she was apparently carrying on some kind of affair with another man? How could she kiss his cheek and ask about his well-being when she was living a double life that would destroy him if he confronted her with what he had seen? I'm fine, he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange and distant even to his own ears. Just tired, I think. She nodded and continued moving around the kitchen, humming softly under her breath. It was a song he recognized but couldn't place, something she had been humming more frequently lately. Had Marcus introduced her to it? Was it their song? The thought made him feel physically sick. Charles forced himself to eat breakfast, though everything tasted like cardboard. He made conversation about their plans for the weekend, about Bailey's upcoming vet appointment, about the weather forecast. All the while, his mind was spinning with questions and doubts, and a growing sense of betrayal that felt like it was eating him alive from the inside. When it was time for him to leave for work, Camilla walked him to the door as she always did. She straightened his tie, kissed him goodbye, told him to have a good day, and to drive safely. It was their ritual, performed thousands of times over the years, but now it felt like a cruel mockery of everything he had believed about their marriage. During his commute to the office where he worked as an accountant, Charles found himself analyzing every interaction they had shared over recent months. The late dinners she had explained away with emergency shifts. The weekend she had gone to visit her sister but had been oddly vague about the details when she returned. The new lingerie he had found in their laundry, which she had claimed was an impulse purchase to make herself feel good. At work, his colleagues noticed his distraction. His secretary asked if he was feeling well. His business partner commented that he seemed unusually quiet during their morning meeting. Charles tried to focus on the spreadsheets and financial reports that usually absorbed his attention completely, but his mind kept drifting back to that name on Camilla's phone. Marcus, the man who was apparently stealing his wife's affections and destroying his marriage without Charles even knowing they were at war. By lunchtime, Charles had made a decision that terrified and sickened him in equal measure. He needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wondering and suspecting and slowly dying inside from uncertainty. If Camilla was having an affair, he needed to know. If there was an innocent explanation for what he had seen, he needed to know that too. He spent his lunch break walking through the small downtown area near his office, trying to gather the courage to go home and confront his wife. The familiar streets and shops that usually brought him comfort now felt foreign and strange, as if the revelation about Camilla's possible infidelity had altered his perception of everything around him. Even the sandwich shop where they sometimes had lunch together on weekends looked different, tainted by the possibility that she might have been lying about her feelings for him during all those pleasant meals together. When Charles finally returned home that evening, later than usual because he had driven around their neighborhood several times before working up the nerve to pull into their driveway, he found Camilla in their living room. She was sitting on the couch they had picked out together 5 years ago, reading a book and occasionally reaching down to pet Bailey, who was sprawled contentedly at her feet. The scene was so domestic and peaceful that for a moment, Charles allowed himself to hope that he had imagined everything, that the message on her phone had been some kind of misunderstanding. "How was your day?" she asked, looking up from her book with a smile that reached her eyes. It was the same smile that had made him fall in love with her all those years ago, the same smile that had gotten him through difficult times and celebrated good news with him, and made him believe that he was the luckiest man alive to have found such a perfect partner. "It was fine," he said, hanging his coat in the closet and trying to keep his voice steady. "How was yours?" "Relaxing. I caught up on some reading, did a load of laundry, took Bailey for a long walk through the park. Oh, and I started dinner. Your favorite, pot roast with all the vegetables you like." The smell of the cooking meal filled their home with warmth and comfort, but Charles felt none of it. Instead, he He felt like he was standing outside his own life, watching a stranger interact with a woman who might be a stranger too, despite 23 years of marriage. How well did he really know Camilla? How much of their life together had been real, and how much had been an elaborate performance? That night, as they sat down to dinner together, Charles studied his wife's face across their dining room table. She looked exactly the same as always, beautiful, intelligent, caring. She asked about his day, shared stories from her own, laughed at his jokes, complimented the wine he had chosen from their small collection. Everything was perfectly normal, which made the abnormality of his situation feel even more surreal. After dinner, as they cleaned up together in their kitchen, working in the synchronized harmony that came from decades of shared domestic routines, Charles finally worked up the courage to mention Marcus's name. "How are things going at work?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Is Marcus still working on that project you mentioned last week?" He watched carefully for any change in her expression, any sign of guilt or discomfort. But Camilla simply nodded and continued rinsing dishes as she answered. "Oh yes, the cardiac unit renovation is keeping everyone busy. Marcus has been working overtime almost every day. He's very dedicated to his patients." The ease with which she spoke Marcus's name, the lack of any visible reaction to Charles's question, only deepened his confusion. Either she was an incredibly skilled actress, or there really was some innocent explanation for what he had seen on her phone that morning. But the memory of those words, "Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you," burned in his mind like a brand. That night, as they lay in bed together, Charles listened to Camilla's breathing gradually slow and deepen as she fell asleep. Her hand rested on his chest, as it had almost every night for 23 years. Her body was warm and familiar beside him, fitting against him in the way that only came from decades of sleeping together. But Charles felt like there was an ocean of distance between them, filled with secrets and lies and the terrible possibility that everything he had believed about their marriage was nothing more than an illusion. He stared at the ceiling until dawn, replaying every moment of their relationship, searching for signs he might have missed, clues that might explain how they had arrived at this moment of crisis. Outside their bedroom window, the world continued its normal rhythm. Cars passed on their quiet street. The neighbor's cat stalked through their garden. The newspaper delivery truck made its early morning rounds. But inside their bedroom, Charles felt like time had stopped, suspended between the life he had known and the devastating truth he was afraid to discover. The following morning brought no relief to Charles's tormented mind. If anything, the sleepless night had only intensified his need to understand what was happening in his marriage. As Camilla prepared for another shift at the hospital, moving through their bedroom with the efficient grace of someone comfortable in her routine, Charles watched her every movement for signs of deception. The way she chose her clothes seemed more deliberate than usual. The extra time she spent on her makeup appeared suspicious. Even the perfume she sprayed on her wrists, a scent he had bought her for Christmas 2 years ago, now carried sinister implications. "I'll probably be late again tonight," she said, kissing his forehead as she gathered her purse and keys. "Dr. Peterson wants all the nurses to stay for the monthly training session. It's about new protocols for cardiac patients." Charles nodded and made appropriate responses, but inside his head, alarm bells were ringing. Was this another lie? Was she really going to work? Or was she planning to meet Marcus somewhere private where they could continue whatever relationship they had been conducting behind Charles's back? The uncertainty was eating him alive, transforming every interaction with his wife into a potential confrontation with deception. After Camilla left for work, Charles found himself alone in their house with his suspicions and fears. He tried to go about his normal routine, but everything felt contaminated by doubt. The coffee mug Camilla had used still sat in their kitchen sink, lipstick marks on the rim that now seemed like evidence of secrets rather than simple traces of her morning routine. The book she had been reading lay open on their coffee table, and Charles found himself wondering if Marcus had recommended it, if perhaps they had discussed it during intimate conversations that Charles knew nothing about. Unable to concentrate on work, Charles called in sick and spent the morning wandering through their home like a detective investigating a crime scene. He examined their shared spaces with new eyes, looking for evidence of betrayal that might have been hiding in plain sight. In their bedroom closet, he noticed clothes he didn't remember seeing before. In their bathroom, he found a new brand of shampoo that Camilla had never mentioned purchasing. Each discovery felt like another small confirmation that his wife was living a secret life parallel to their marriage. The photographs that covered their mantelpiece and filled their albums suddenly looked like historical documents from a relationship that might have been built on lies. There was their wedding day, both of them young and radiant with hope. Their first house, a tiny apartment where they had been so happy despite having almost no money. Vacations they had taken together, family gatherings where they had presented themselves as the perfect couple. Anniversary celebrations where they had renewed their promises to love and honor each other. Had any of it been real for Camilla, or had she been going through the motions while her heart belonged to someone else? Charles found himself in his home office, staring at their joint computer, wondering if he should look through Camilla's email account. They had always trusted each other completely, sharing passwords and leaving their devices unlocked around each other without a second thought. But now that trust felt naive and foolish. How many other wives had discovered their husbands' affairs through shared computers? How many husbands had found evidence of infidelity in browser histories and private messages? His finger hovered over the mouse for what felt like hours. Looking through Camilla's private communications would be a violation of everything they had built together, a crossing of boundaries that could never be uncrossed. But not knowing the truth was killing him slowly, poisoning every memory they shared and every moment they spent together. What was worse, violating her privacy, or living the rest of his life wondering if their marriage was a lie? Before he could change his mind, Charles clicked on Camilla's email account. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears as the page loaded, revealing dozens of messages from various sources. Most were routine communications, confirmations from doctor's appointments, newsletters from stores where she shopped, updates from family members. But there, buried among the ordinary correspondence, was what Charles had been dreading to find. Multiple emails from Marcus Thompson, sent over the past several months. The subject lines were carefully innocuous: schedule changes, patient discussion, training materials. But as Charles opened them, his worst fears began to materialize on the screen before him. The early messages were indeed professional, discussing work schedules and patient care protocols. But gradually, they became more personal. Marcus mentioned enjoying their coffee breaks together. He complimented Camilla's insights during staff meetings. He asked about her weekend plans and shared details about his own life. Charles scrolled through months of correspondence, watching in horror as the professional relationship slowly transformed into something more intimate. Marcus began addressing her as Cam instead of Camilla. He made jokes that seemed designed for an audience of one. He referenced conversations they had apparently shared outside of work, private moments that Charles knew nothing about. And then, in the most recent exchanges, the tone shifted dramatically. "I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday," Marcus had written just 3 days ago. "You look beautiful in that blue dress. I hope we can find time to talk more privately soon." Camilla's response made Charles feel physically ill. "I've been thinking about it too. Charles is working late tomorrow. Maybe we could meet for coffee somewhere quiet." The words on the screen blurred as tears filled Charles's eyes. There it was, in black and white, confirmation that his wife was actively planning to meet another man in secret. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, sharp and deep and devastating in its completeness. 23 years of marriage, 25 years of relationship, reduced to a secret coffee date arranged while her husband was working to support their shared life. But even as the evidence mounted before him, Charles found himself grasping for alternative explanations. Maybe they really were just meeting for coffee as friends. Maybe Camilla was going through some kind of crisis and needed someone outside their marriage to talk to. Maybe Marcus was the one pushing for something inappropriate, and Camilla was simply being polite. These desperate rationalizations felt pathetic even as he thought them. But Charles clung to them because the alternative, accepting that his wife was betraying him, seemed impossible to bear. He continued reading, though each message felt like another nail in the coffin of his marriage. Marcus wrote about missing her when they weren't working the same shifts. Camilla responded with messages about feeling confused and torn between what I should do and what I want to do. There were references to stolen moments in supply closets, to meaningful looks exchanged across hospital corridors, to the difficulty of pretending nothing was happening when they were around other colleagues. The timeline of their correspondence matched perfectly with changes Charles had noticed in Camilla's behavior. The first flirtatious message from Marcus coincided with the period when she had started paying more attention to her appearance. The escalation of their emotional intimacy aligned with when she had begun working more late shifts and weekend hours. Her growing distance from Charles corresponded exactly with her growing closeness to Marcus, as documented in their increasingly personal email exchanges. Charles printed several of the most damning messages, his hands shaking as he fed paper into their home printer. The machine's mechanical sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house, each printed page falling into the tray like physical evidence of his wife's deception. He stared at the papers in his hands, wondering if this was how his marriage would end, with email printouts scattered across his home office desk like divorce papers waiting to be filed. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. Charles called his office and extended his sick leave through the end of the week, claiming a stomach virus that wasn't entirely untrue. He did feel nauseated and weak, though the cause was emotional rather than physical. He wandered through their house, picking up objects that suddenly felt like artifacts from a museum exhibit about his failed marriage. The wedding ring he had placed on Camilla's finger 23 years ago. The coffee maker they had bought together when they moved into their first real house. The shared books on their shelves, many with notes in the margins where they had communicated with each other across the years through written commentary. When Camilla returned home that evening, Charles was sitting in their living room with Bailey at his feet, pretending to read a magazine while actually studying his wife's face for signs of guilt. She looked tired but not unusually so, stressed but in the way that was normal after a long day at the hospital. She kissed him hello, asked about his day, mentioned that she was hungry, and suggested they order pizza instead of cooking. Everything about her demeanor seemed completely normal, which somehow made her deception feel even more calculated and cruel. "How was the training session?" Charles asked, though he already suspected there had been no training session at all. "Oh, exhausting," Camilla replied without missing a beat. "Dr. Peterson really packed a lot of information into those few hours. My brain feels completely fried." The lie came so easily from her lips that Charles wondered how many other lies he had accepted without question over recent months. How many times had she invented work obligations to cover meetings with Marcus? How many nights had she come home and kissed him after spending time in another man's arms? The thought made him feel sick with betrayal and anger and a desperate sadness that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. That night, as they lay in bed together, Charles pretended to sleep while actually watching Camilla through half-closed eyes. She seemed restless, checking her phone multiple times and smiling at messages she received. In the dim light from her screen, her face looked different somehow, softer, happier, lit up with an excitement that Charles realized he hadn't seen in their relationship for years. Was this how she looked when she thought about Marcus? Was this the expression she wore when she was genuinely happy, in a way that apparently had nothing to do with her husband anymore? Around midnight, Camilla slipped quietly out of bed, taking her phone with her. Charles heard her soft footsteps on the stairs, then the faint sound of the kitchen door opening and closing. She was going outside, probably to make a phone call she didn't want him to overhear. After 20 minutes, she returned to bed, settling beside him with what seemed like contentment. Charles lay awake for hours afterward, imagining the conversation she might have had with Marcus while he pretended to sleep upstairs. The next morning brought a text message to Camilla's phone that Charles intercepted when she stepped into the shower. It was from Marcus. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I've been counting the hours since we made plans." Tonight. They were meeting tonight, and Charles finally had the opportunity to discover the full truth about what was happening in his marriage. As he heard the shower running upstairs and his wife humming happily behind the bathroom door, Charles made a decision that terrified him. He would follow Camilla that evening. He would see for himself exactly what kind of relationship she was having with Marcus Thompson. Whatever he discovered would finally put an end to the torture of not knowing, even if the truth destroyed everything he had believed about their life together. The day stretched endlessly before him as Charles tried to act normal while planning his surveillance of his own wife. He had never imagined that marriage could lead to such a moment, where love and trust had been replaced by suspicion and detective work, where the person he had promised to cherish forever had become someone he needed to investigate like a criminal. But as Camilla prepared for another day at work, kissing him goodbye with lips that might soon be kissing another man, Charles knew he had no choice but to pursue the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The evening Charles had been dreading arrived with cruel normalcy. The autumn sun set behind their neighborhood trees in shades of gold and amber, painting their house in warm light that should have felt comforting but instead seemed to mock the coldness growing in Charles's chest. Camilla moved through their dinner preparations with her usual efficiency, humming that same unfamiliar song while she prepared a salad and reheated leftover soup. She had told him she needed to return to work for a few hours to help with a patient emergency, a story that Charles now knew was almost certainly fabricated. Dr. Martinez called and asked if I could come in to assist with a complicated case. She explained, not quite meeting his eyes as she spoke. It shouldn't take too long, maybe 3 or 4 hours at most. Charles nodded and made appropriate concerned sounds about her having to work so late, all while watching his wife construct elaborate lies with the same care she once used to plan surprise parties for his birthday. The casualness of her deception was almost as devastating as the betrayal itself. She packed her purse, checked her appearance in their hallway mirror, and kissed him goodbye with lips that felt like ice against his cheek. "Don't wait up for me," she said softly. "You need your sleep." After her car disappeared around the corner at the end of their street, Charles waited exactly 10 minutes before following. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his sedan, a practical car they had chosen together for its reliability and fuel efficiency. Now it felt like a surveillance vehicle as he drove through their familiar neighborhood, following a route he suspected would not lead to the hospital where Camilla claimed to be working. Instead, as Charles had feared, Camilla's car turned toward downtown, heading in the opposite direction from her workplace. Charles followed at a careful distance, his heart pounding with each traffic light and turn. The rational part of his mind still hoped for an innocent explanation. Maybe she really was meeting a colleague somewhere. Maybe there was a legitimate reason for her to be going downtown instead of to the hospital. But the printed emails in his jacket pocket told a different story, and deep down, Charles knew he was about to witness the final confirmation of his worst fears. Camilla's car pulled into the parking lot of the Riverside Inn, a small boutique hotel on the edge of downtown that Charles recognized from newspaper advertisements and occasional mentions in local society pages. It was the kind of place where people went for romantic getaways or special anniversary celebrations, not the kind of place where hospital colleagues would meet to discuss patient care. Charles parked across the street, hidden behind a row of mature oak trees, and watched as his wife of 23 years stepped out of her car and walked confidently toward the hotel entrance. She looked beautiful in the golden light from the hotel's outdoor lamps, wearing a dress Charles had never seen before, something flowing and elegant that flattered her figure in ways her usual practical work clothes did not. Her hair was styled differently too, softer and more romantic than the efficient ponytail she typically wore. Everything about her appearance suggested a woman preparing for a romantic encounter, not a professional meeting with a colleague. Charles sat in his car for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the hotel entrance and trying to process what he was witnessing. Part of him wanted to drive away, to go home, and pretend he had never followed her, to maintain the comfortable illusion that their marriage was intact. But a larger part of him needed to know the complete truth, no matter how devastating it might be. Just as Charles was working up the courage to get out of his car and confront whatever was happening inside the hotel, a second vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Charles recognized the driver immediately from photographs he had seen on the hospital website when he had researched Marcus Thompson earlier that week. The man was younger than Charles had expected, maybe in his late 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested someone comfortable with taking what he wanted regardless of the consequences. Marcus walked into the hotel with the casual familiarity of someone who had made this journey before. He carried a small overnight bag, confirming Charles's worst suspicions about the nature of this meeting. This wasn't an innocent coffee date or a professional consultation. This was a planned romantic rendezvous between his wife and another man, conducted with the kind of careful preparation that suggested their affair had been going on for much longer than Charles had realized. The drive home passed in a blur of rage and heartbreak. Charles found himself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white, his mind racing between anger at Camilla's betrayal and fury at his own blindness to what had been happening right under his nose. How long had they been meeting like this? How many times had Camilla lied about working late while actually spending intimate hours with Marcus in hotel rooms? How many mornings had she come home to Charles after spending nights in another man's arms? Back in their house, Charles paced through rooms that suddenly felt like a museum of his failed marriage. Every photograph, every shared purchase, every memory embedded in their furniture and decorations now seemed tainted by the knowledge of Camilla's deception. The couch where they had watched movies together on countless weekend evenings. The kitchen table where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations. The bed where they had made love and shared dreams and built what Charles had believed was an unshakable partnership. Bailey sensed his distress and followed him from room to room, the golden retriever's concerned brown eyes reflecting Charles's own confusion and pain. At least the dog's loyalty was uncomplicated and honest, unlike the woman Charles had trusted with his heart. and his future. He sat on their living room floor and buried his face in Bailey's fur, fighting back tears of rage and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm him completely. When Camilla returned home shortly after midnight, Charles was waiting in their darkened living room. She entered through the kitchen door as she always did, moving quietly to avoid waking him, clearly expecting to find him asleep in their bedroom. Instead, she found him sitting on their couch in the darkness, still fully dressed, staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. "Charles," she said, her voice uncertain as she reached for the light switch. "What are you doing up? Are you feeling all right?" "Don't turn on the light," Charles said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We need to talk." Even in the darkness, he could see Camilla's posture change as some survival instinct told her that this was not a routine late-night conversation. She remained standing near the kitchen doorway, as if positioning herself for a quick escape, her purse still clutched in her hands like a shield. "What's wrong?" she asked, though Charles could hear the forced innocence in her voice. "Did something happen while I was at work?" "That's an interesting question," Charles replied, reaching into his jacket pocket for the printed emails. "Since we both know you weren't at work tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles could hear Camilla's sharp intake of breath, could sense her mind racing for explanations and excuses and ways to minimize the damage of being caught in her lies. But he was done with her stories, done with her deceptions, done with pretending their marriage was something it clearly wasn't. "I found the emails, Camilla," he continued, his voice growing stronger as his anger overtook his heartbreak. "I know about Marcus. I know about your secret meetings. I know about the lies you've been telling me for months. And tonight, I followed you to the hotel." Camilla sank into the chair across from him as if her legs had suddenly lost the ability to support her weight. In the dim light filtering through their windows, Charles could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, but he felt no sympathy for her distress. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences of those choices. "Charles, please let me explain," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Then, explain it to me," Charles said, leaning forward. "Explain how you never meant to fall in love with another man. Explain how you never meant to lie to my face every single day for months. Explain how you never meant to destroy our marriage while pretending everything was fine between us." Camilla buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that Charles felt no inclination to comfort. "I don't know how it happened," she said through her tears. "Marcus and I started talking at work, just casual conversations during breaks. He was going through a divorce, feeling lonely and lost. I was trying to be a good colleague, a friend. But somehow it became something more." "When?" Charles demanded. "When did you decide that being a friend meant betraying your husband?" "There wasn't a specific moment," Camilla said, looking up at him with eyes red from crying. "It happened gradually. We started having coffee together, then longer conversations, then dinner a few times when you were working late. I told myself it was innocent, that we were just friends who understood each other. But I was lying to myself as much as I was lying to you." Charles felt his anger building like pressure in a kettle about to explode. "How long, Camilla? How long have you been having an affair?" "It's only been physical for about 6 weeks, she said quietly, as if the timeline somehow made her betrayal less devastating. "Before that, we were just close friends. But, yes, I know that's still cheating. I know I've been unfaithful to you, and I know how much I've hurt you." 6 weeks. Charles calculated quickly in his mind, realizing that Camilla had been sleeping with Marcus throughout their recent anniversary celebration, through family dinners where she had smiled and laughed and acted like a devoted wife, through countless nights when she had come home and shared their bed while carrying the scent and touch of another man on her skin. "Do you love him?" Charles asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Camilla's silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Charles felt his heart break a little more with each passing second. When she finally spoke, her words destroyed what little hope he had been clinging to. "I think I do," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Charles. I never wanted to hurt you like this. I never wanted our marriage to end this way. But, yes, I think I love him." The admission hung in the air between them like poison gas, contaminating everything it touched. Charles felt 23 years of marriage crumble to dust in that moment, felt the future they had planned together disappear like smoke. The woman sitting across from him, crying and apologizing and confessing her love for another man, was a stranger wearing his wife's face. "Get out," Charles said quietly, his voice deadly calm despite the hurricane of emotions raging inside him. Charles, please, Camilla begged. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can try to save our marriage. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I still love you too. We can find a way to fix this. You love us both? Charles asked, his voice rising for the first time since the conversation began. You think you can have an affair for months, lie to my face every single day, sleep with another man in hotel rooms, and then come home and tell me you love me too? It's complicated, Camilla said desperately. I know it sounds impossible, but I do love you, Charles. What Marcus and I have is different, but it doesn't mean what you and I had wasn't real. Had, Charles repeated, seizing on her choice of words. Past tense. You're right about that, Camilla. What we had is over. What we had died the first time you chose to betray me, the first time you chose him over our marriage, the first time you decided that your happiness was more important than your promises to me. Charles stood up from the couch, suddenly, unable to bear sitting in the same room with the woman who had destroyed his life with such casual cruelty. I want you gone by the time I get home from work tomorrow. Take whatever you need, but I want you out of this house, out of my life. We're done. Charles, please don't do this, Camilla sobbed, reaching toward him as he walked past her chair. Please give us a chance to work this out. I'll end things with Marcus. I'll do whatever it takes to save our marriage. Charles stopped in the doorway and turned back to look at his wife for what he knew would be the last time. You want to save our marriage now? After months of destroying it? After falling in love with another man? After lying to me every single day? It's too late, Camilla. You made your choice when you chose to have an affair instead of talking to me about whatever was wrong in our relationship. You made your choice when you chose to meet him in hotel rooms instead of working on our marriage. And now I'm making mine. As Charles walked up the stairs to their bedroom, leaving his wife crying in their living room, he felt something inside him harden like steel. The man who had discovered those messages on Camilla's phone just a few days ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some betrayals were so complete, so devastating, that they could never be forgiven or forgotten. The marriage he had believed in was truly over, and tomorrow he would begin the painful process of building a new life from the ashes of the old one. Charles spent that night alone in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling while listening to Camilla moving around downstairs. He could hear her opening drawers, closing cabinet doors, and occasionally breaking into fresh sobs that echoed through their house like the sound of everything they had built together falling apart. Part of him wanted to go downstairs and comfort her, to hold her while she cried, and find some way to make everything go back to the way it was before he discovered her betrayal. But a larger, colder part of him remained unmoved by her tears. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with the consequences. When Charles finally fell asleep near dawn, it was the restless, nightmare-filled sleep of someone whose world had been turned upside down. He dreamed of their wedding day, but, in his dreams, Marcus was standing at the altar instead of him. He dreamed of their anniversary dinners, but, in his dreams, Camilla was checking her phone throughout the meal, smiling at messages from another man. He dreamed of their house, but, in his dreams, every room was empty, stripped of the shared memories that had once made it a home. Charles woke to find the other side of the bed already empty and cold. Camilla's pillow still carried the faint scent of her perfume, but her presence was gone from their bedroom in a way that felt permanent and final. When he went downstairs, he found evidence of her departure scattered throughout their kitchen. The coffee maker was still warm, suggesting she had made her morning coffee one last time in their shared space. Her favorite mug sat in the sink, unwashed, like a small monument to the end of their domestic routines. A note waited for him on their kitchen table, written in Camilla's familiar handwriting on paper torn from the notepad they used for grocery lists and household reminders. Charles stared at it for several minutes before finding the courage to read words that he knew would probably hurt him even more than her spoken confession had. Charles, the note began, I know my words can't undo the pain I've caused you, but I need you to know that I never intended for our marriage to end this way. I never intended to fall in love with someone else. I never intended to become the kind of person who could lie to the man she promised to love and honor forever. But intentions don't matter now. What matters is that I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way, and I understand why you can never forgive me. I've taken only what I brought into our marriage, and a few personal items that belong to my mother. Everything else we built together belongs to you now. The house, the furniture, the shared bank accounts, even Bailey. I know how much you love him, and he deserves to stay in the only home he's ever known. I'll send you my new address once I find a place to live, so your lawyer can send me whatever papers need to be signed. I want you to know that what we had was real, even if I destroyed it. The 23 years we spent together weren't a lie, even though the last few months were. You are a good man, Charles, better than I deserved. You'll find someone who appreciates your loyalty and your love in ways I obviously failed to do. I hope someday you can remember our good years without too much pain. Please don't try to contact me. Let's end this with whatever dignity we have left. I'm sorry for everything. Camilla. Charles read the note 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of pain and anger. Even in her goodbye, Camilla was making decisions for both of them, deciding what he deserved and what he should remember and whether they should have contact going forward. She was controlling the narrative of their breakup just as she had controlled the narrative of their marriage, feeding him carefully constructed stories while living a completely different reality. The house felt impossibly large and quiet without Camilla's presence. Charles had never realized how much of their daily soundtrack came from her movements. The sound of her getting ready in the morning, her humming while she cooked, her phone conversations with friends and family, her laughter at television shows they watched together. Now the silence felt oppressive, broken only by Bailey's confused whimpering as the dog searched through rooms looking for the missing member of their family. Charles called in sick to work again, though he was beginning to realize that his absence wasn't temporary. How could he sit in meetings and review financial reports and make small talk with colleagues when his entire life had been revealed as an elaborate fiction? How could he concentrate on other people's business problems when his own personal foundation had crumbled beneath him? His secretary's concerned messages filled his voicemail, but Charles couldn't imagine explaining his situation to anyone yet. Instead, he wandered through their house like a ghost haunting his own life. In their bedroom, Camilla's absence was everywhere. Empty hangers in the closet where her clothes used to hang, vacant space on the bathroom counter where her cosmetics had lived, a bare nightstand where her books and personal items had cluttered the surface for years. She had been thorough in her departure, taking nothing that belonged to both of them but leaving behind obvious empty spaces that announced her abandonment. Charles found himself examining their shared possessions with new eyes, wondering which items carried memories of her affair and which belonged to their innocent past. The dining room table where they had eaten dinner just 2 nights ago while she planned her hotel meeting with Marcus. The couch where they had watched movies while she secretly texted another man. The bed where they had made love while she was simultaneously conducting an emotional affair with a colleague. Every surface in their house felt contaminated by the knowledge of her deception. The worst part was the photographs. Their house was filled with framed pictures documenting 25 years of relationship. Their early dating days when they both looked impossibly young. Their engagement parties surrounded by friends and family. Their wedding day when they had been so certain their love would last forever. Anniversaries and vacations and holiday celebrations that now felt like evidence of the biggest lie Charles had ever believed. He found himself staring at Camilla's face in these pictures, searching for signs of the woman who could eventually betray him so completely. Had the seeds of her infidelity been there all along, hidden behind smiles that he had interpreted as genuine love? By afternoon, Charles realized he needed to talk to someone before the isolation, and anger drove him completely insane. He called his older brother David, a man he hadn't spoken to in several months due to the normal busyness of adult life. David lived 2 hours away with his own family, but he had always been Charles's closest confidant during times of crisis. Charles, David answered on the second ring, his voice immediately concerned. This is a surprise. How are things going? Charles found himself unable to speak for several seconds. The simple question of how things were going suddenly, impossible to answer. How could he summarize the destruction of his marriage in a casual phone conversation? How could he explain that his wife of 23 years had been living a double life for months? David, Charles finally managed, his voice cracking with emotion he hadn't expected. I need to tell you something, and I don't know how to say it. Camilla has been having an affair. Our marriage is over. The silence on David's end of the line stretched long enough that Charles wondered if the connection had been lost. When his brother finally spoke, his voice was filled with shock and disbelief. What? Charles, are you sure? That doesn't sound like Camilla at all. She's always seemed so devoted to you, so happy with your marriage. Are you certain you're not misunderstanding something? Charles almost laughed at his brother's reaction, recognizing his own initial desperate search for innocent explanations. I'm sure, David. I found emails between them going back months. I followed her to a hotel where she met him. She admitted everything when I confronted her. She even said she loves him. Jesus Christ, David breathed. I can't believe this. You guys always seemed like the perfect couple. At family gatherings, at holidays, you always seemed so solid, so happy together. I never would have guessed she was capable of something like this. Neither would I, Charles said bitterly. Apparently, I never really knew her at all. 23 years of marriage, and it turns out I was living with a stranger who was just very good at pretending to be the woman I fell in love with. David's shock gradually transformed into protective anger on his brother's behalf. What a selfish, cruel thing to do to you. And to throw away everything you built together for some workplace fling? She's lost her mind, Charles. She's going to regret this decision for the rest of her life. But Charles found no comfort in the possibility of Camilla's future regrets. Her remorse, if it came, would be far too late to repair the damage she had done to their marriage and to his ability to trust anyone completely again. She's already moved out, Charles told his brother. Left me a note saying she was sorry and that I deserved better. Even her apology felt like another lie, another way of controlling how this story gets told. What are you going to do now? David asked gently. It was a question Charles had been avoiding thinking about directly. What did he do now? How did someone rebuild their life after discovering that the central relationship they had built everything around was a fiction? How did someone learn to trust again after being so thoroughly deceived by the person they trusted most? I don't know, Charles admitted. File for divorce, I guess. Try to figure out how to live alone after 23 years of marriage. Try to understand how I could be so completely blind to what was happening in my own house with my own wife. This isn't your fault, Charles, David said firmly. You can't blame yourself for trusting your wife. You can't blame yourself for not being suspicious of someone you had no reason to suspect. She's the one who chose to betray you. She's the one who chose to lie to you every day for months. She's the one who destroyed your marriage. Intellectually, Charles knew his brother was right. But, emotionally, he couldn't shake the feeling that he must have missed important signs, must have failed as a husband in some way that drove Camilla to seek love and excitement elsewhere. Had he become too predictable, too comfortable, too boring for a woman who needed more adventure and passion than their stable marriage could provide? Had he taken her for granted in ways that made her vulnerable to another man's attention and romance? Listen, David continued. I'm going to drive down this weekend. You shouldn't be alone right now. And we need to talk through some practical stuff, lawyers, finances, all the logistics of ending a marriage. But, more importantly, you need family support while you process this betrayal. After hanging up with David, Charles felt marginally less isolated but no less devastated. Having someone believe his story and validate his anger helped, but it didn't change the fundamental reality that his marriage was over and his future looked completely different than he had imagined just 1 week ago. That evening, Charles sat in their living room with Bailey curled up beside him, both of them staring at the empty chair where Camilla used to sit while reading her books and checking her phone. The dog seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in their household, that the pack had been permanently altered in ways that couldn't be fixed. Charles found himself talking to Bailey as if the golden retriever could understand the complexities of human betrayal and heartbreak. It's just us now, boy, Charles said, scratching behind the dog's ears. I guess we're going to have to figure out how to be a family of 2 instead of 3. As night fell around their house, Charles realized this was the first evening in 23 years that he would go to sleep alone in their bed by choice rather than circumstance. Camilla wasn't working late or visiting family or away on a trip that would end with her return. She was gone permanently, living somewhere else, probably with Marcus, starting a new life that had no room for the husband she had betrayed so thoroughly. The loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing down on Charles's chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. But underneath the loneliness was something else, a tiny seed of something that might eventually grow into relief or even freedom. For the first time in months, he didn't have to wonder what Camilla was really doing when she claimed to be working late. He didn't have to study her face for signs of deception or analyze her words for hidden meanings. The uncertainty and suspicion that had been eating him alive were finally over, replaced by the devastating but clear reality that his marriage was finished and his wife was gone. 6 months later, Charles sat in his newly renovated kitchen, drinking coffee from a mug he had bought for himself rather than inherited from his marriage. The morning sunlight streamed through windows he had recently cleaned, illuminating a space that finally felt like his own rather than a museum of his failed relationship. Bailey lay at his feet, no longer searching the house for Camilla's missing presence, having adapted to their new routine with the resilience that Charles envied and tried to emulate. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago, a surprisingly quick process made possible by Camilla's cooperation and her apparent eagerness to move forward with her new life. She had signed every document without contest, accepted the financial settlement Charles's lawyer had proposed, and maintained the no-contact agreement she had suggested in her goodbye note. Charles had heard through mutual friends that she and Marcus were living together now, apparently planning to marry once the social awkwardness of their affair-turned relationship had faded enough for a public wedding. Charles found that he no longer felt the sharp stab of betrayal when he heard updates about Camilla's new happiness. The initial rage and heartbreak had gradually transformed into something more manageable, a dull ache of disappointment mixed with genuine relief that he no longer had to wonder about her feelings or question her honesty. The woman who had spent months lying to his face every morning was Marcus's problem now, and Charles was surprised to discover that he felt sorry for the man rather than jealous of him. The house had undergone significant changes during the months since Camilla's departure. Charles had hired contractors to repaint every room, choosing colors that reflected his own preferences rather than the compromises that had defined their shared decorating decisions. He had replaced their bedroom furniture with pieces he selected entirely for his own comfort, bought new linens that carried no memories of his failed marriage, and transformed their former guest room into a home office where he could work on the freelance accounting projects that were gradually replacing his full-time employment. Most dramatically, Charles had removed or donated almost all of the photographs that had once documented his relationship with Camilla. The frames that used to hold their wedding pictures now displayed landscapes he had photographed during weekend trips to places they had never visited together. The mantelpiece that once showcased their anniversary celebrations now held books he was reading, plants he was learning to care for, and a small sculpture his niece had made for him in art class. The process of erasing their shared history from his living space had been more therapeutic than painful. Each removed photograph and donated piece of furniture creating more room for the person Charles was becoming rather than the person he had been during his marriage. He was discovering preferences and interests that had been subsumed under the compromises and considerations required by partnership. He liked jazz music more than he had realized when it had competed with Camilla's preference for classical compositions. He enjoyed cooking experimental meals for one rather than preparing the familiar dishes that had pleased both of their tastes. He preferred reading in bed rather than watching television, a habit he had abandoned during marriage to accommodate Camilla's evening routines. David had been true to his word about providing support during the immediate aftermath of Charles's discovery. His brother had spent several weekends helping with practical matters like finding a divorce lawyer, understanding financial implications, and simply being present during the worst periods of emotional upheaval. But, more importantly, David had helped Charles recognize that the end of his marriage, while devastating, was also an opportunity to rediscover who he was as an individual rather than as half of a couple. "You haven't been single since you were 22 years old," David had pointed out during one of their conversations. "You went straight from college into a serious relationship with Camilla, then into marriage, then into this settled domestic routine that defined everything about how you lived. Maybe this is a chance to figure out what Charles wants rather than what Charles and Camilla wanted." The observation had initially felt irrelevant to Charles, who was too consumed by betrayal and heartbreak to think about personal growth or silver linings. But, as the months passed, and the acute pain of Camilla's deception faded into a more manageable chronic disappointment, Charles began to understand what his brother meant. He was learning things about himself that had been buried under decades of compromise and accommodation. Charles had started taking evening walks through different neighborhoods in his city, exploring areas he had never had reason to visit during his married years. He discovered a small bookstore that hosted poetry readings on Thursday nights, events he had started attending with the tentative interest of someone learning to be social as a single person rather than as part of an established couple. He had joined a photography club that took weekend trips to scenic locations, filling his Saturdays with activities that had nothing to do with the domestic routines that had once defined his weekends with Camilla. Most surprisingly, Charles had begun to realize that his marriage, even before Camilla's affair, had not been as happy or fulfilling as he had convinced himself it was. In the harsh light of hindsight, he could see patterns of dissatisfaction and emotional distance that had been building for years before Marcus appeared in their story. Camilla had been withdrawing from their relationship gradually, becoming less engaged in conversations, less interested in shared activities, less enthusiastic about physical intimacy. But, instead of addressing these changes directly, They had both chosen the easier path of maintaining comfortable routines while their emotional connection slowly withered. Charles wondered now if Camilla's affair had been as much an escape from an unsatisfying marriage as it had been a betrayal of their vows. The possibility didn't excuse her deception or make her choices less hurtful, but it helped Charles understand that their marriage had been ending long before Marcus appeared to deliver the final blow. They had been living as roommates rather than lovers for years, going through the motions of partnership, while both secretly yearning for something more passionate and engaging. This realization brought Charles a complicated mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because it meant that the marriage he had mourned so deeply had actually been over long before he realized it was in trouble. But also relief because it meant that Camilla's betrayal hadn't destroyed something that was genuinely healthy and thriving. It had simply revealed problems that were already present but unacknowledged. Charles had started therapy 6 weeks after Camilla's departure, initially seeking help with processing his anger and betrayal, but gradually using the sessions to explore larger questions about relationships, trust, and personal growth. His therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chun, had helped him understand that his experience, while painful, was also an opportunity to develop a healthier relationship with himself before attempting to build new relationships with others. Many people spend their entire lives in relationships that are comfortable but not necessarily fulfilling, Dr. Chun had explained during one session. They stay together because breaking up seems too difficult or because they're afraid of being alone, not because they're genuinely happy or growing together. Your situation is horrible, but it's also given you a chance to start over with more self-awareness and clearer priorities. Through therapy, Charles had begun to identify patterns in his personality that had contributed to the problems in his marriage. His conflict avoidance had led him to ignore warning signs and accept explanations that didn't really make sense rather than pushing for difficult conversations. His desire to be a good husband had caused him to suppress his own needs and preferences in favor of maintaining domestic harmony. His fear of abandonment had made him cling to a relationship that was no longer working rather than addressing problems that might have led to separation. These insights were painful but also liberating. Charles was learning to express his opinions more directly, to advocate for his own needs rather than automatically deferring to others, and to trust his instincts when something felt wrong rather than talking himself out of legitimate concerns. He was becoming someone who would be much more difficult to deceive or manipulate, someone whose future relationships would be built on genuine compatibility rather than comfortable routine. Charles had also reconnected with friends he had lost touch with during his marriage, rediscovering relationships that had been casualties of the couple-focused social life he had shared with Camilla. His college roommate Mike had invited him to join a monthly poker game that Charles attended with the nervous excitement of someone learning to be social again. His former colleague Jennifer had become a regular coffee companion, someone who listened to his struggles with divorce and shared her own experiences with rebuilding life after major disappointments. The dating question loomed on the horizon, though Charles wasn't ready to seriously consider romantic relationships yet. He was still learning how to be comfortable alone, how to make decisions without consulting a partner, how to fill his time with activities that genuinely interested him rather than compromises that pleased both members of a couple. Dr. Chun had encouraged him to take as much time as he needed before attempting romantic relationships, pointing out that the best partnerships were built between people who were happy and complete as individuals rather than people seeking completion through relationships. But Charles had started to imagine what a future relationship might look like, and his vision was dramatically different from what he had shared with Camilla. He wanted a partner who communicated directly rather than harboring secret dissatisfactions. He wanted someone whose presence enhanced his life rather than requiring him to diminish himself to maintain harmony. He wanted a relationship built on genuine compatibility and shared growth rather than comfortable routines that masked underlying problems. On this particular morning, as Charles sat in his renovated kitchen with his dog at his feet, and his coffee growing cold while he read a book about landscape photography, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine contentment with his own company. The loneliness that had threatened to overwhelm him during the first months after Camilla's departure had transformed into solitude that felt peaceful rather than painful. His phone rang, interrupting his reading, and Charles glanced at the screen to see David's name. His brother called every few weeks to check on his progress and share updates about his own family, conversations that had become important anchors in Charles's new routine. "How are you doing, little brother?" David asked, his voice carrying the warmth that had sustained Charles through the worst periods of his divorce. "Better," Charles answered honestly, realizing as he said it that it was completely true. Actually better, not just pretending to be better. I'm starting to think this whole disaster might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. That's a hell of a thing to say about your wife's affair, David replied with a laugh. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm serious. I was so focused on being angry about Camilla's betrayal that it took me months to realize how unhappy I had been in our marriage. We weren't growing together anymore. We weren't really communicating about anything important. We were just existing in the same house, going through the motions of being a couple. Charles paused, looking around his kitchen at the changes he had made, at the evidence of a life being rebuilt according to his own preferences and priorities. I'm discovering who I am when I'm not trying to be half of a couple that wasn't working anyway. And I like this person better than the man I was when I was married. David was quiet for a moment before responding. I'm proud of you, Charles. When this all started, I wasn't sure you were going to survive it emotionally. But you've done the hard work of rebuilding rather than just wallowing in anger and self-pity. That takes real strength. After ending the call, Charles returned to his book, but found himself thinking instead about the journey he had traveled from discovery to acceptance to rebuilding. Camilla's betrayal had shattered his world, but it had also forced him to examine that world honestly and recognize how much of it had been built on compromises and accommodations that served neither of them well. Charles knew he would always carry some scars from his first marriage, some caution about trusting too quickly or loving without reservation. But he also knew that these scars had taught him valuable lessons about himself and about relationships that would serve him well in whatever came next. He had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between maintaining a relationship and nurturing a partnership, between comfortable routine and genuine happiness. As the morning sun climbed higher in his kitchen window, Charles felt ready for whatever his rebuilt life might bring him. The man who had discovered those devastating messages on his wife's phone 8 months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more honest about his own needs and limitations. The future was uncertain, but it was his future to shape rather than a compromise between his dreams and someone else's expectations. Bailey stretched and yawned at his feet, then looked up at Charles with the patient devotion that had sustained them both through the hardest months of their transition. Charles reached down to scratch the dog's ears, grateful for the unconditional loyalty that had reminded him daily that some relationships could be trusted completely, that some love was exactly what it appeared to be. "What do you think, boy?" Charles asked his faithful companion. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Bailey's tail thumped against the kitchen floor in response, and Charles took it as an enthusiastic yes to whatever adventures their new life might hold.